Welcome back, Beans Army, to another episode of the Less is More Sports Podcast, the college offseason podcast, where you could say we're less of the regular season, but more of the offseason. We actually have a historic show here on the Less is More Sports Podcast today. For the first time, we have both Ryan and Matt on the show. So definitely excited. I think the viewers are definitely going to be excited to hear from both of you all today. And as for the content we're going to be talking about today, we've talked about the players that are going to be in new places, the recruits, the transfer portal guys, but we haven't stressed enough about the impact of some of the guys that are leaving some of these programs. So, what we're going to do today is that Matt and Ryan are going to give their top five players that are going to be the hardest to replace, and then they're going to give their top five players that are could maybe even be better at the next level than they were in college. But before we get started, as you all learned from last episode, Ryan, like me and Matt, has a team in college sports. Well, he has actually two teams, more like me, one of which did what his other team should do and fired their head basketball coach. So, Ryan, if you had to pick anyone in the college basketball scene or even outside of the college basketball scene, who do you want the Buckeyes to have as their next basketball head coach?
This was tough. And you look around college basketball and you don't there's not a lot of coaches I feel like that could be candidates. I've read the articles, I've seen the candidates, and my two candidates would probably be Greg McDermott from Creighton and Sean Miller. I'm a little iffy about Sean Miller, but he led Xavier to the Sweet 16 last year, and Greg McDermott led Creighton to the Elite Eight. And when you look at Chris Holtzman's team, they they have a good record going in January, and then the January slump hits every single year, and it almost seems like they are not built for the Big Ten. That is a problem because they are in the Big Ten. So I just I think that Ohio State needs a kind of new refresh, and I was, to be honest, very surprised that they fired him through the season. So
I'm kind of interested with the two choices that you said. Sean Miller, fun fact, Matt and I actually interviewed a player that plays for Sean Miller currently in Davion McKnight on the show a few months ago. Very good. I personally think a very good coach, definitely a really good recruiter. So I mean, you all hit the recruiting scene even harder with that one. McDermott is the one that stands out to me because McDermott, yes, very good coach, and I know he's been a very popular name that's thrown around as the next Buckeyes head coach. But my thing is, when he first got to Creighton, Creighton really wasn't known as like the program that it is known today, right? And I feel like he's been there so long and he's developed something at Creighton. I feel like if we were ever going to see McDermott leave, I feel like it would have been after his son Dougie McBuckets left for the NBA. That's my personal opinion. But I think if Ohio State was to get Greg McDermott, it would absolutely be a great hire. So I love your candidates. Matt, do you have anything to add to that? Or are you ready to get on to the main portion of the show?
The other good thing with Miller is that the buyout is incredibly low compared to some of the other candidates you're looking at if you're Ohio State. So I think Miller would be a very safe bet. The guy knows the area. He's been at Xavier. He can recruit kids down in Cincinnati to come up to Columbus. He can recruit the Columbus area. And the things he got in trouble for, as we've said a million and one times, don't matter anymore. But Ohio State has a chance to do the funniest thing, and I think they should hire Tom Crean. That's it.
Tom Crean.
Yes.
yeah,
Tom
Wait,
Crean
is
should
that
be
serious? Are you
every.
serious or are you joking right now?
What do you think, Les?
I don't know, Matt. I don't know what you think half the time.
Oh, that's good. I keep you
You,
guessing. But
you
no,
are
I'm
okay as a podcast host. You are how like most defensive players describe playing Peyton Manning. If you try to get inside your head, you're going to get lost.
my head is a maze. I'm mostly kidding. I think Tom Crean will get a job this year, but not at Ohio State. I'm just going to say that for every coaching rumor, just as a recurring joke because I love Tom Crean. Okay.
yeah. Chris Holtzman. Well, I think Ohio State was really done by. You could tell that they were done by them paying his buyout, 12.8 million. That is a lot of money for a buyout. I think they are just ready for a new fresh start and their
Yeah.
basketball program to be back on tracks.
And Miller is in the price range to get that. I think it's either probably Miller or I'm going to throw out another name I don't think a lot of people are talking about, which is Lamont Paris, a
Hmm.
guy we talked about a few weeks ago at South Carolina. Has got Big Ten coaching experience. The thing that I think will keep him from moving is that he's basically a first year coach. You just don't go somewhere for a year and then move on. But I would love to see him. He was on the bench in Wisconsin. He knows how to do the Big Ten. He wants to make South Carolina the Big Ten of the Wisconsin to the SEC. That's another move I would be interested to see if it happens. I don't think it will, but I would like to see that. But I think Miller is probably the guy they're going to go with.
I would say leave it to Matt to name the guys that a lot of people aren't thinking of. That is one of his specialties here on the podcast, and that is why he is one of the best podcast hosts around. And as for the idea of Sean Miller with the buyout being so low, I mean that's a good thing for Ohio State because if they don't have any money left over from all the bags that they're given in NIL to get out land all these high profile transfers, hey, it might be the best option. But moving on to the main portion of the show, as we mentioned earlier, there's been so many moving pieces in college sports altogether, but especially college football, whether it be through the recruiting scene, whether it be through the transfer portal. But we haven't stressed enough about the value of those guys that you're just kind of thinking, damn, we got to replace that guy. So, anyways, Matt and Ryan are going to name their top 5 hardest to replace players in college football. And because Ryan, this is the first episode with Ryan and Matt, I'm going to have Ryan go first. So, Ryan, who is your number 5 player that is going to be the toughest to replace for their team?
This was a tough list to make because I feel like there are so many good players and other people that is hard to replace. But my fifth player is Jaden Daniels, quarterback from LSU. He's the reigning Heisman winner. He's a dual threat quarterback. He can run too. He's very fast. He had two long rushing touchdowns versus Florida. And if they had a defense, I thought Harold Perkins was supposed to be that guy on defense. I think he didn't have a good year this year. But if they had a defense, I think they could have been in the playoffs. But I consider him my number 5. They have a really good backup in Garrett Nussmeier. I think he's really good. We saw a little bit of him this year, but I love Jaden Daniels going into the draft. I think he has potential to be really good.
Starting off strong with the reigning Heisman Trophy winner. I like it. And of course, as I think more also worth noting is that not only does LSU lose Jaden Daniels, but they also lose their offensive coordinator, Mike Denbrock, one guy that Matt and I have been very high on in the show. But speaking of Matt, Matt, get into your number 5 hardest player that's going to be replaced.
Well, with number 5, I went for the obvious, and a lot of my guys, think, I guess you could define them as more cultural picks as opposed to. I mean, they're great on the field players, but guys who fit the culture of the programs have set a tone pretty well. So my number 5 is pretty obvious. I went with Will Howard of Kansas State, moving away from Kansas State, heading to Ohio State for a team that's overperformed in the last few seasons, much better than we thought they would. Like I said, overperforming. Moving to the new Big 12 with all the new teams coming in. I think if they would have had him, it would have been a really interesting thing to see how they would have happened because that guy has been like a breakout candidate for a lot of different awards. I mean, anytime you lose a quarterback, you're losing your team's leader, you're losing the guy who sets the tone, and it's a good get for Ohio State, but it's a bad drop off for Kansas State, a team that's overachieved in my opinion. And when you lose your tone setter like that, it could be a rough season for you. So at my number 5, I've got Will Howard leaving Kansas State, going to Ohio State.
I have 2 things to say before Ryan gets into his number 4. Number 1, this might be a conflict of interest because now we have an actual Ohio State fan on the podcast. And number 2, I'm really glad that you brought up the cultural impact that a lot of these players are going to have because, you and I have talked about this many times on the podcast. It's a lot of things that what not only what you see on the field, but what you see off the field is what determines the success of a lot of these college football teams, college sports teams, really anything in life, really. So I'm really glad that you said that. So shout out to you, my friend. Ryan, get into your number 4 for me.
For my number 4 player, I have Caleb Williams, quarterback from USC, projected number 1 pick. I watched the bowl game versus Louisville. Obviously, it was disappointing for Louisville because they thought a lot of fans thought that it was going to be a win because they didn't have Caleb Williams. But you know, it looks like it'll be Miller Moss playing or starting quarterback who threw 6 touchdowns in the Holiday Bowl. And the reason I have Caleb Williams is, just like LSU and Jaden Daniels, they didn't have a defense. A, they had terrible defense for the past 2 years that killed them in the late stretch. Like in the Pac-12 championship versus Utah 2 years ago. And they do have some good returning players that were very young. They have Zachariah Branch, who is one of the best punt returners and freshman wide receivers, and they have also Deuce Robinson, who's a 5-star tight end. And I they went 8-5 this season, and I think that it will be kind of similar next season. I'm not sure if the defense will improve. We will just have to see next year. But yeah, so Caleb Williams is my number 4 player.
I'll say I want to add one thing before we get into Matt's number 4 player. Is one thing I've learned from watching Lincoln Riley over the years is that you never really have to worry about offense. He's coached 3 Heisman Trophy winning quarterbacks. Offense is always going to be there, but I think the one thing that has held him back from maybe winning a national title or making deep college football playoff runs is the fact that he does have a defense. So I think that is definitely worth pointing out. And I ran the numbers, earlier in the season. That USC defense was absolutely awful. And on the preseason, I predicted USC to win the national title because I thought they were going to have a lot of pieces that fixed that awful defense. And that made me look stupid as hell. I'm not even going to lie. But moving on, just for time constraints, Matt, get into your next player.
My number 4 is another guy who I'm calling one of those cultural picks. I'm going with Will Shipley out of Clemson. Didn't have the season that a lot of us thought he would have this year, but still a guy who was the heart and soul of like a Dabo Swinney team, and we know how much he values people like that. We know how versatile he can be. He was a 1,000-yard guy before this season, even though this season we were still kind of like, Clemson wasn't as good as we thought they were gonna be. Number one, we talked before, Les, you and I, about how like we fear kind of that this could be the end of an era. And losing a guy like that, who, even though he didn't have the kind of performance on the field you expected due to injuries and other issues, is still a guy who, you look to for leadership. A guy who's been there, a guy who knows your system, a guy who can ball out when he's healthy. And so that's why I'm going to go with Will Shipley at number 4, a guy who I think will be a pretty interesting steal for an interesting player at the NFL level. I think he could be a steal if he goes to the right situation. So that's who my number 4 is. I'm going to go with William. I'm going to go with Will Shipley just because we've seen what he can be when he performs, and we see what kind of guy he is in importance to what Dabo Swinney wants to do at the Clemson program.
I had a rebuttal ready for this pick, but this is why I get way too impatient sometimes, because I should have waited to hear your reasoning before I made this rebuttal, because I was ready to talk about the season Phil Mafah had. And I was like, oh, is Matt not a believer in Phil Mafah? But then he comes on here and starts talking about the cultural impact. And I'm like, I don't have a rebuttal for that. So, credit to you, Matt.
I believe.
No, I hear you. No, I understand. But no, credit to Matt. He's just like showing me up this podcast. I like it. Anyways, Ryan, get into your number 3 for me.
My number 3 is, I feel like he could have potential to be number 1. The top 3, a little toss up. I think number 1 is like dead set at number 1. But my number 3 is Michael Penix Jr. from Washington. Washington is losing absolutely everything. They're losing head coach Kalen DeBoer, losing two or three wide receivers. They're losing Rome Odunze and then Jalen McMillan. I'm not sure about Polk, but yeah, Washington's offense was so good this year, and it was due to Michael Penix being so good. He probably had the deep ball, the best deep ball in college football. Every time he threw it up, it seemed like it was being caught by those really good receivers. And yeah, I think that he definitely could have played a little bit better in the national championship game, but what a run by Washington. I think that they'll have a big drop off next year because they're losing everyone.
I feel like you could say a lot of people could have played better against that Michigan defense. Shout out to that Michigan defense. Shout out to Jesse Minter, who, is following John Harbaugh to the NFL level. Let's just be honest, man. Washington's depleted all around. They're losing Penix. They're losing Odunze, McMillan. Obviously their head coach, Kalen DeBoer, offensive coordinator, Ryan Grubb. I mean, they're just a depleted team right now. I mean, it's, the new coach is just going to have his work cut out for him. But for time constraints, moving on, Matt, who is your number 3 player?
I've got a guy who was only there at his program for a year, but was an absolute game wrecker, and a guy who I think is going to go pretty highly May. I forget exactly when the NFL draft is, but I'm going with Jared Verse of Florida State. The type of guy who, on that defensive line, with 9 sacks and 23 tackles, was kind of the dude, if you paid more attention to, that turned the guys around him into better players. Guys like Braden Fisk had breakout years because you're paying so much attention to Jared Verse. I think he was and that's the kind of game wrecking defensively that you can't really prepare for. It's like, do I cover? It's like the Aaron Donald effect. Do I cover this guy and risk the other 5-star guy going off when I know this guy's good? You pick your poison. You pick how you're going to be death by 1,000 cuts. And I think, I'm sure Florida State's going to be the way their season ended. They're still going to be fine. They're going to rebound. They're Florida State. But the way their season ended with like all those questions, all those bowl issues, not playing, losing to 60 points to Georgia, I think losing a guy like Verse to the draft, it's going to be one of those things where how do you even replace a guy where other teams were planning their game plan around him, which made your other guys even better. So I think that's going to be the big loss of Versus. He's going to be a great pro, I think. But that's what's going on for me. I've got number 3, Jared Verse of Florida State, just because of the impact he had on that defensive line and how people game planned around that Florida State defense. Not to mention the other guys on that Florida State defense who are leaving too. So it's one of those how do you fix a problem when you don't even know what's coming type things. So yeah, number 3, Jared Verse.
And who knows? Maybe if Florida State had Jared Verse, maybe they instead of losing by 60, they lose by 30. Hey, you never know. That's the impact that those kind of players have. So moving on, Ryan, huh?
They could have lost 28-3 or something.
Something like that. Anyways, Ryan, moving on to your number 2 selection.
I like how Matt and I's list they're kind of polar opposites. He's going with more positional players, and I'm more quarterback dominant. And I love that we're talking about different players. But for my number 2, I actually have 2 players on the same team. I have J.J. McCarthy and Blake Corum. Their run game is really what won them a lot of games and won the national championship. The ground and pound run game with their big offensive line. Blake Corum's really good in getting through contact. Donovan Edwards had 2 long runs in the national championship game. But I think that their impact will be rough for Michigan. Leaving will be rough for Michigan. They next year they'll probably have quarterback Alex Orji, and they still have Donovan Edwards next year. But I just don't think it's the same. When the run game couldn't really get going, JJ McCarthy could light it up with throwing his. He was really accurate, and he threw the ball about 97 miles an hour. But it was usually always accurate, and it was them leaving will have a huge impact on Michigan next year.
Before Matt gets into his number 2 selection, I just have to say that it might be a good idea after the show that I might have to go on the Twitter page and actually run the poll. Who has actually been more depleted, Washington or Michigan? I feel like this could be a really good conversation. So definitely good that we have both Michigan and Washington players on this list so that we could actually ask this question. So anyways, moving on to number 2, Matt's number 2. Sorry, Matt, who's your number 2?
I'm going with another guy who, and I know people when they hear this are going to be like, well, this program cranks out guys at this position like Marvel cranks out movies. And it's true because I'm going with Joe Alt of Notre Dame at number 2 because Notre Dame does crank out offensive linemen. Let's not kid ourselves there. There's probably, if you strike Joe Alt down, 2 more will rise in his place. It's like a hydra of like offensive tackles. But you're still losing a guy who's pretty dang important, a transitional piece between like the end of like one era and the beginning of another. And when you get a guy like that, especially with a new quarterback coming in and Riley Leonard, how you got to prepare to protect that guy right off the gate. And there are some things that like the dude taking Joe Alt's place might not know that Joe Alt did. And I know Notre Dame plays a weird schedule, but there's something to be said about having a veteran offensive line. You could have a 5-star recruit who's really good, but he's still got to figure out the game. And I know Riley Leonard's a good quarterback. He's coming off an injury, though. And this is a very important season for Marcus Freeman going forward. So I'm going to go with Joe Alt just because I know this program is like a machine when it comes to cranking out offensive linemen. But with a new quarterback who's coming off an injury, who likes to be mobile and playing the schedule you do, having a veteran offensive lineman is a key piece that it's going to take even a while to replace to have a guy step into those shoes.
I need you to get out of my head, Matt. because I was ready to rebuttal this before we got on the show. And then before I even got the chance, he addressed it from the start. You know, Matt took his time and did his homework before this episode. I'm not even going to lie.
I actually did not.
I would have ran with that personally, but, hey. So, anyways, for time constraints, moving on to Ryan's number one hardest to replace. Who you got?
My number one is going a little bit out of the box. It's not a player, but it is former head coach for Alabama, Nick Saban. I think that he is truly the hardest to replace because everyone wanted to be like Nick Saban. You saw the success of his assistants like Kirby Smart, Jimbo Fisher. They were all assistants for Nick Saban at a time, and now they're running their own programs. Parents of these recruits, they want their kids to go to Nick Saban. Nick Saban makes recruits turn into men. He makes them have a good responsibility. You know, Nick Saban is a game changer in college football, and I think that he is the toughest to replace. And I'm throwing my prediction out there. I think I personally think that he should be the cover of the new NCAA football game.
Ooh, kind of foreshadowing moment, but we'll get into that later. And I'm going to make a really cheesy pun here and say that Ryan, of course, had to address the biggest elephant in the room of the college offseason. So moving on, Matt, who is your number one toughest to replace?
Well, it's funny. He goes with the coach. I go with the program, which is a program we've been hitting at the whole time, which is basically Washington. The entire freaking program, man. Like Ryan said before, Penix is gone. Polk is gone. He declared for the draft. McMillan's gone. Adunze's gone. You lose your coach who led you to the promised land almost. It's like having like Luke Skywalker defect to the Empire the minute they're about to blow up the Death Star. But he's going to Alabama. He's part of the evil empire now. Jed Hirsch, he's a good hire, but it's going to take a while. And I mean, you look at all the guys they've lost. In addition to losing guys in the draft, you lose Jabbar Muhammad, you lose Trey Watson, you lose Ethan Barr, you lose a lot of guys. And even though you've managed to snag Will Rogers back after his epic one picture at the NCAA championship game, which will live on in infamy, you still now have a new coach, a transfer quarterback, even though he's a veteran, and who knows who else will be on this roster next year. Oh, and guess what? You're going to the Big Ten, where you're going to be which you're going to be playing in Bloomington, Indiana, in the middle of no on a cold Thursday, November night. It's going to be a rough adjustment for anybody trying to get used to that. Or when you're in the middle of Iowa City, Iowa, trying to figure out the defense there with like whatever minimal starters you've returned, if you've returned any. So Washington, yeah, you're basically replacing a whole program. This is like losing your GM, head coach, quarterback, and hell, even the owner in the NFL in 1 year. And I, for one, am going to be interested to see how they adjust to this. What happens? What are the growing pains? Because of all the times for this to happen, it's when you choose to jump conferences and play in a conference that's probably, if not tougher, is not really the right word. A little bit more physical, I would say, than the Pac-12 was, where you're playing playing thousands upon thousands of miles away from home. So yeah, number one, Washington, the entire program. What's going on there?
I mean, like I said, we're going to have to vote in the Twitter poll later. I mean, or sorry, the fans are going to have to vote in the Twitter poll later. Who is the more depleted program, Washington or Michigan? I think it's actually a legit conversation. But for time constraints, and I think we're going to have to do a speed round here. Give us the quickest description you can. Our next top five for both Ryan and Matt is going to be the players. Obviously, a lot of these guys were great college players, but as we all know, the NFL is a completely different game. So they're going to give their top five players that could be even better at the next level than they were in college. And because we started with Ryan the previous round, I'm going to start with Matt this go round. So, Matt, who is your number five player?
My number five player is a guy who I think could be a little bit of a project. And you've probably never heard of this guy, and I don't blame anybody. But I'm going with Kieran Adenje from Yale. Yes, I'm going with an offensive lineman from Yale. Let me tell
Matt
you
went
about
with a
this
mid
guy.
major. Who would have thunk it?
Yeah, I know. This guy is incredible. 6'6", has some of the longest arms I've ever seen, is a total mound of human being. He's going to be really impressive because he's just got the physical attributes. Yeah, I know Yale isn't exactly a big football program, but we have guys from the Ivy League that make it in the NFL every year, especially guys who are 6'6" with some very long arms. In fact, this guy's biggest knock on draft boards is that he's too aggressive. That's going to be probably the guy Kansas City gets in like the second or third round, who becomes the new Orlando Brown Jr., and they win 5 more Super Bowls. But yeah, keep your eyes out for Kieran Amenaje of Yale. Very good player.
Ryan, who's your number 5 player?
My number 5 player is Xavier Legette, wide receiver from South Carolina. He's 6'3", 227. He had over 1,200 yards this year. He made Spencer Rattler look good. He was probably Spencer Rattler's favorite target. And he did really well at the Senior Bowl. So that's my number 5 player.
Very good sleeper pick. I like it. Matt, who is your number 4 player?
Jerzon Newton from Illinois. Big defensive lineman, played in the Big Ten West, match made in heavens for a lot of teams that need pass rush. Another guy who I think will probably go in the second, third round area, but could play like a first round talent just because of the tenacity he brings to the defensive side of the ball. So I'm going with Jerzon Newton from Illinois as my number 4 pick.
So we got about 10 minutes to go, so we're going to have to speed through these. Ryan, who's your next player on your list?
My number 4 player is Keon Coleman, wide receiver from Florida State. You could probably tell a pattern. I love these tall wide receivers. I love him as a prospect. I think could be really good on any team that he goes, and he's a freak athlete for the wide receiver position.
He was he had a catch of the year nomination and only showing sign of things to come. Matt, who is your next player?
Another name I may end up butchering, but Latu, defensive end, UCLA.
How
Another
can
one
you
of those.
butcher it if it's the same first and last name, Matt?
I think it's Leatu, actually, Leatu from UCLA, a defensive end. I think this guy's going to go in the first round. Very similar to Newton in his like profile, just another very big guy. If he goes to a team like New Orleans or Indianapolis or the Raiders, which is where I think the area he's probably going to go is, he's going to be a difference maker because those teams are already pretty okay when it comes to pass rush. This guy's going to take it to another level. He beat the hell out of the USC offensive line. Not tough, I know, but still rather impressive in the game I was able to see him. So I'm very excited to see what Latu will do at the next level. So I'm going to go with him at number 3.
If you're new to joining the podcast, Matt has actually been very high on this UCLA defensive line for a very long time. So I feel like this pick was a very appropriate selection for him. So moving on, Ryan, who is your next player?
My number 3 is probably very surprising. He gets a lot of hate and some love, but I go with Caleb Williams. I think that he will prove the doubters wrong, and I think that he will be a great guy. And I think that he will go number 1 for the Bears. The Bears will probably trade Justin Fields to maybe the Falcons or somewhere else, but I think that he will surprise a lot of people.
Low key, that is actually kind of a hot take because of all the hype surrounding Caleb Williams. A lot of scouts actually saying, like, oh, he's one of the most, if not the most talented quarterback prospect of all time. I've been doing this show long enough that I remember when Caleb Williams was in high school, and I even said back at that age that he was the most talented high school quarterback prospect that I had ever seen. So I kind of like it. Even though like Caleb Williams, big name, you maybe not think that's maybe a hot take, but with all the hype surrounding him, saying that he could even be even better at the next level is a big statement. And I guess I take it Ryan is not a fan of Merrill Hodges' comments about Caleb Williams. But anyways, for time constraints, Matt, go to your number 2 selection.
Yeah, number 2, this is a class where we've got like guys like Keon Coleman. We've got Marvin Harrison Jr., obviously. Everyone loves him. Malik Neighbors out of LSU. There are a lot of very good wide receivers in this class, but nobody, I think, is giving Rome Odunze his flowers. I think this guy is going to be one interesting player in the NFL. He's 6'3", 215. He's got incredible speed. We saw that happen. We saw how effortlessly he can change directions. We've seen how good his jab steps are. I think he's going to be great. I think his problem is he just maybe a little bit, his footwork needs a little bit of work. He's a bit lighter than people think. But I think the way he catches balls that look like they're 5 miles over his head is going to pay off greatly in the NFL. And I think with the position he's going to go in, like I said, there are guys like Marvin Harrison Jr. and Malik Neighbors who are ranked higher. He's going to go to a team where he doesn't have to be the guy like Marvin Harrison Jr. will be probably in Arizona or Chicago. He's going to go to a team where maybe he can start off as a secondary receiver, use that speed, use that insane catchability, use those jab steps to get wide open because somebody's paying attention to somebody else. And I think that's going to pay off going forward. So I'm going to go with Rome Odunze at number 2.
My personal opinion, you said not a lot of people are showing Rome Odunze enough love. Well, I am clearly not one of those people because if we didn't have a generational superstar at the wide receiver position in this draft, I would say Rome Odunze would be the top receiver selected.
Right.
My opinion. Outside of Maserati Marv, I think he is the best receiver in this class. And speaking of Maserati Marv, Ryan, isn't that your number 2 selection?
It is. To be honest, I was gonna pick Roma Dunze because I love him as a prospect, but I didn't want all wide receivers on my top 5 list, so I decided to change it up. But my number 2 is Marvin Harrison Jr. from Ohio State. I love Marvin Harrison Jr. He's probably my favorite player in college right now, or going to the draft. He's around 6'4", 205, way bigger than his dad. His dad was a really, really good player for the Colts under Peyton Manning. But Marvin Harrison Jr.'s work ethic is unbelievable. Coach Day even said it. He's after a game, even if he didn't drop a pass, he's still out in the facility using the jugs machine, working on his game. He's also taking care of his body all the time. And he said he wants to be the greatest. He wants to be the best receiver of all time. And I think that he will be really, really good in the pros, and I can't wait to see him.
Well, I don't know if we're going to be able to see him wearing the Apple Watch or the Louis Vuitton cleats at the next level, but one thing I do know for a fact is that I have been on this podcast many times saying, as a longtime Colts fan, that he is way more talented than his pops was. So, well, I can't wait to see Marvin Harrison Jr. at the next level. Okay, sorry, I can't wait to see Maserati Marv at the next level. So, for time constraints, Matt, get into your top player that's going to be even better at the next level.
This is a guy who I think could actually have an impact immediately because of the situation he's most likely to be in. And that's Olu Fashanu of Penn State, the great offensive lineman. A guy like him could end up in a situation, weirdly enough, with the Jets. And what we're thinking of, like, they desperately need offensive line help, and they've got arguably one of the best quarterbacks of all time coming back coming back in to start after one of the most disappointing seasons in NFL history. And if they get a guy like Olu Fashanu, a guy who I think is really good, really talented, and put him where he can protect Aaron Rodgers in his first year, and Aaron Rodgers is the player he was before, he could be the most impactful rookie because he could affect how the Jets season goes. We know they had a bad offensive line last year. Getting a guy like this after having the disappointing season increases that potential a little bit to be better. And if he plays like I think he can play, he could be the difference between the Jets making the playoffs with their hopefully repaired quarterback or not, because I think he's that good. I think he'll be in a weird situation. If he goes to Tennessee, he's still going to be great. Don't get me wrong. But protecting Will Levis is a lot different than protecting Aaron Rodgers, especially when if you go to the Titans, the expectations are here. And if you go to the Jets, they're beyond my computer screen, through my roof, and into the stratosphere. So I'm going to go with Olu Fashanu, regardless of where he goes, but because not only is he a great player, he has the potential to be part of an intriguing situation.
It's funny that you talk about a potential future Jets offensive lineman because that just made me think of, way back when we were still social media in sports and I had that indirect moment of where I threw shade at DeBrickashaw Ferguson. Good times.
I forgot about that.
I was like, I had to bring it up from the past, buddy. But anyways, we got about 2 minutes left. So Ryan, quickly get into your top player that is going to be even better at the next level.
Since I'm an Ohio State fan, you would probably think that I would go Marvin number 1, but I am going with Brock Bowers, tight end from Georgia. I love Brock Bowers. He is great after the catch. He can catch anything. He really sparked Georgia's offense, and when they didn't have him, there was definitely a missing piece. But I absolutely love Brock Bowers. I think that he could have like a Sam Laporta this year, but maybe even better in the next NFL season. Sam Laporta was really good, but I think that Brock Bowers will have one of the best seasons for any tight end.
It's funny because there's a viral pic going on right now where, you have Brock Bowers standing next to Rob Gronkowski, and now all the shade's starting to come out, all the knocks, could he be too small, this, that, whatever. So Ryan is not hearing any of that is what I'm hearing. And anyways, that wraps up my co-host's top five of players that are going to be even better at the next level. And because we have less than a minute before we have to get off the show, as always, be sure to like and subscribe to Less is More Sports YouTube and Spotify channel. Be sure to follow the social media pages on Facebook, Twitter, and Threads. That's at Less is More Sports. And like I said earlier in the podcast, a little bit of a foreshadowing moment. Our next episode, the highly anticipated debut of the video game we've been waiting almost a decade for. The new college football video game, Matt, don't look at me like that, is finally coming out, and we're going to be talking about it on the next episode. Stop shaking your head, Matt. I don't care if you don't play video games or not. Stop it.
Read a book, Les.
I've read plenty of books. I have a Duke book laying on my nightstand right now. I've been reading The Black Phone. Do not give me that, sir. I was a journalist for a living. I can read a lot. Trust me.
Oh.